Let's get one thing straight before we even start. The most important contract in women's basketball history was just signed, and the most important name in that contract doesn't appear anywhere in the actual document. Not once. And yet, every single person who was in that negotiating room, every executive, every agent, every player rep who sat across that table for 17 months, they all knew exactly whose name they were really writing around. This is the story of how one player rewrote the financial DNA of an entire professional league without ever being credited for it on paper, and how the people who benefited the most from that shift are the same ones who have spent 2 years pretending it wasn't happening. The WNBA just passed the biggest collective bargaining agreement in the history of professional women's basketball. Salary caps exploded, minimum wages more than doubled. Players who spent years grinding overseas just to make ends meet are now looking at contracts that would have seemed like science fiction 3 seasons ago. Everyone is celebrating, everyone is posting, everyone is calling it a victory for the league, for the players, for women's sports as a whole. And technically, all of that is true. But there's a version of this story that nobody in the league's official press releases wants to tell. A version that's more complicated, more uncomfortable, and a whole lot more honest. And that's the version we're going to tell right now. Because behind the celebration, there's a salary cap squeeze that's about to reshape one of the most promising rosters in the league. There's a veteran superstar whose frustration has been boiling under the surface for 2 years and is now impossible to ignore. There's a clause buried inside this new agreement that has an unofficial name that the league will never use publicly, but that everyone in women's basketball already knows. And there's one player, one singular presence, whose impact on this league is now so undeniable that it had to be written into a legally binding labor agreement without ever using her name. So let's go back to where this really starts, because the new CBA didn't happen in a vacuum. 17 months. That's how long the WNBA and the Players Association sat across from each other and hammered out what this league was actually worth. 17 months of arguments, proposals, counteroffers, walkouts, and late-night calls between lawyers who were all trying to figure out how to price something that had changed almost overnight. Because the old collective bargaining agreement, the framework that had governed player salaries and working conditions for years before this, was built for a completely different league. It was designed for a league that was fighting for relevance, a league that was grateful for whatever television deal it could get, a league where selling out an arena was an achievement worth celebrating in a press release. That league no longer existed. By the time negotiations were really heating up, the WNBA had become something that nobody in those early boardrooms could have predicted. Arenas that hadn't seen a full house in years were suddenly turning people away at the door. Broadcast rights packages that would have been laughed out of the room half a decade ago were now being treated as serious competitive bids by networks that wanted in. Viewership numbers that had been stagnant for over a decade were smashing records on a weekly basis. The league had crossed the 1 million viewers per game threshold for the first time since 2008. And every single time an executive pointed to a number, every time a player rep cited a metric, every time someone at the negotiating table said, "Look at what this league has become," there was one name underneath every one of those figures. The rating spike had a name. The attendance surge had a name. The jersey sales, the social media impressions, the casual sports fans who had never once watched a WNBA game but suddenly knew the schedule by heart, all of it traced back to the same source. And the players knew it. The owners knew it. The league knew it. The only thing they hadn't yet done was put a dollar sign next to it. That was about to change. Before we talk about what changed, we need to talk about what the old numbers actually looked like. Because if you don't understand how absurd the previous salary structure was, you won't fully appreciate what just happened and why it was so long overdue.
Caitlin Clark, in her rookie season, earned $78,066. Read that again. $78,000. That's not a misprint. That's not a typo. That is the actual, verified, contractually obligated salary that the Indiana Fever paid to the player who was, by every measurable standard, the single most impactful figure in professional women's basketball. The player whose name on an away schedule caused opposing teams' ticket sales to spike overnight. The player who helped push WNBA viewership to numbers the league hadn't seen since the early 2000s. The player whose jersey was outselling everyone else in the league by a margin that wasn't even close. That player was taking home $78,000 a year. To give you some context for how ridiculous that number is, a mid-level paralegal in a decent-sized city earns somewhere in that range. An entry-level marketing coordinator, fresh out of college, sitting behind a desk at a company that nobody has ever heard of, working in a city that nobody travels to on vacation, makes approximately what the WNBA was paying its most valuable player. And while Clark was earning that paralegal salary, she was generating $16.1 million in total income for 2025 through endorsements, public appearances, speaking engagements, business partnerships, and commercial deals with brands like Nike, State Farm, Gatorade, Wilson, and several others. She was the sixth highest paid female athlete in the entire world. The WNBA was paying her less than half of 1% of her total annual earnings. Not half, half of 1%. There is no business school professor in the country who could look at that arrangement and keep a straight face. The league was receiving franchise-level production, franchise-level marketing impact, and franchise-level commercial value, and paying for it at a price that would have been insulting to a mid-tier office worker. The $78,000 wasn't just underpayment, it was a structural absurdity, a rounding error on the actual economic impact this player was generating. And everyone involved, the league, the teams, the sponsors, the networks, knew it and kept cashing the checks anyway. That's the context you need to understand before we talk about the epic clause, because the clause didn't come out of generosity, it came out of inevitability. Here's where the new CBA gets interesting, and we mean genuinely structurally interesting, not just players get paid more interesting. Because buried inside this agreement is a provision that represents something the WNBA has never done before, a formal written acknowledgement that not all players create equal value, that certain players change the economic equation of the league itself, and that the old rookie contract structure was never built to handle that kind of player. The provision is called the EPIC clause, exceptional performance on initial contract, and what it does, in practical terms, is create a fast-track pathway for players on rookie deals to renegotiate their salaries and access maximum or supermax level contracts before their initial 4-year deal expires. Specifically, if a player on a rookie deal earns a spot on the All-WNBA first team or second team, they become eligible for the standard maximum, and if they win the MVP award, they become eligible for the supermax. Now here's the part that nobody in the league's official communications wants to say out loud. The EPIC clause does not include Caitlin Clark's name. The official language is entirely neutral. It refers to performance thresholds and contract eligibility in the kind of dry, technical language that labor lawyers spend their careers perfecting. But every single person who negotiated this agreement, every executive who reviewed it, every player rep who signed off on it, they all understood exactly who this clause was written for. It was written for the situation that Caitlin Clark represented. A player generating an unprecedented commercial impact on the league while being locked into a rookie salary that was written for a completely different era. People in the sports media have already started calling it the Caitlin Rule. The comparison to the NBA's Rose Rule, named after Derrick Rose, which allowed players to earn a higher max if they'd won MVP or made All-NBA teams, is unavoidable and entirely appropriate. The WNBA essentially did the same thing, for the same reason, in response to the same type of situation. They just declined to put the name on the door.
which honestly tells you everything you need to know about how complicated the politics inside that league office actually are.
What the clause means in practice is this. Clark's salary jumps from $78,066 to $530,000 in 2026. That is a 500% increase. And before you start applauding the league for finally doing the right thing, hold that thought for exactly 1 second. Because $530,000 is still, by any honest analysis, one of the most undervalued contracts in professional team sports today. The player generating millions in broadcast value, filling arenas from coast to coast, and driving the league's most significant commercial growth in over a decade, is earning $530,000 on her WNBA deal. The math still doesn't fully work, but at least it no longer makes serious sports business analysts physically uncomfortable just by looking at it. That's progress, even if it's the kind of progress that arrives about 3 seasons too late. And if Clark wins MVP this season, the conversation gets even more interesting. Under the Epic clause, an MVP-winning Clark would be eligible for the Supermax structure immediately. The league would be looking at compensating its most marketable player at a level that actually begins to reflect what she's worth, while simultaneously having to figure out how to build a championship-caliber roster around her under a salary cap that, despite being the largest in league history, still isn't large enough to make every decision easy. The WNBA's new salary cap is $7 million. When you say that number out loud, after years of watching this league operate on a structure where the total cap was $1.5 million, it sounds enormous. It sounds like a revolution. It sounds like the kind of financial infrastructure that a serious professional sports league is supposed to have. And in one sense, it genuinely is all of those things. The increases across the board are real and significant. The minimum salary now exceeds $300,000. The average player wage has jumped from approximately $120,000 to over $600,000. For players who spent years taking overseas contracts during the WNBA offseason just to make a living wage, this CBA is genuinely life-changing. But here's what nobody is putting in the headline. $7 million sounds like a lot until you start actually building a roster with it. And the Indiana Fever, right now, are staring at a math problem that is going to define the next 3 years of the franchise. Start with Clark at $530,000. That's 7.5% of the cap before you've signed a single other player. Then look at Kelsey Mitchell. We'll get into Mitchell's situation in detail in a moment, but under the new CBA, if the Fever use their core designation on her, which is the most logical move to retain her, her salary jumps to approximately $1.4 million. A Supermax contract that she has more than earned, but one that now represents 20% of Indiana's total salary allocation. 20% on one player who is not Caitlin Clark. And then there's Aaliyah Boston, who is max eligible this offseason. Boston has been one of the most fundamentally sound players in the league since she was drafted, and she deserves every dollar she's about to get. But every dollar she gets comes out of that same $7 million pool. And then there's the forward rotation to fill, a backup point guard to sign, and bench depth to develop. The kind of depth that separates teams that make noise in the playoffs from teams that actually win championships. And here's where the arithmetic gets genuinely painful. Clark, Mitchell, and Boston alone, 3 players before anyone else on the roster has signed a contract, would consume more than half of Indiana's entire salary cap. More than half gone on 3 players, with 8 or 9 roster spots still to fill. There is a term for what happens to a franchise in this situation. It's called a cap squeeze, and every major professional league has seen it happen to teams that built correctly around a franchise player, when the franchise player finally gets paid what she's worth, and the ripple effects hit every other contract decision simultaneously. The Fever are about to feel every inch of it. The situation with Sophie also complicates things significantly.
For Indiana to keep the core of what they've been building, Sophie would likely need to accept something close to the league minimum, around $300,000, which is not a given by any stretch. And then there's Lexie Hall. This is a name that casual fans might not have circled on their radar yet, but people inside the league know exactly what's coming. Hall's market value has risen to the point where she could realistically attract offers in the $600,000 to $700,000 range from other teams. That kind of offer, for a player at her level on a squad trying to maximize Clark's window, is exactly the kind of thing that quietly dismantles rosters that look invincible on paper.
The Fever's front office has a genuine, consequential, franchise-defining set of decisions to make. And unlike most front office decisions, these ones are happening under a new salary structure with no precedent to fall back on. Every number is new, every contract is uncharted, and every mistake will cost them in wins. Let's talk about Kelsey Mitchell specifically, because the national conversation consistently undervalues what she actually is. Mitchell is not a complementary player. She's not a role player who benefits from playing alongside a star. She's one of the most dangerous and versatile scoring guards in the entire league, a player who finished in the top 4 of MVP voting last season, a player who can create her own shot from anywhere on the floor, and a player who, without Clark on the roster, would almost certainly be the centerpiece of a franchise. She's Indiana's second-best player, and she's entering the most financially consequential offseason of her career. Under the old CBA, the Fever used the core designation to lock Mitchell into a one-year deal ahead of the 2025 season. That move kept her in Indianapolis. It also set up exactly the situation we're in right now. With the new CBA in place and her market value at an all-time high, Mitchell has every reason in the world to maximize this moment. A Supermax deal at $1.4 million is the correct move for her if her priority is earnings. And nobody could blame her for making that her priority, because this league spent years paying its players a fraction of what the market would bear, and players like Mitchell watched that happen firsthand. But here's the tension. If the Fever commit to Mitchell at $1.4 million long-term, the cap math for everything else on that roster becomes extraordinarily constrained. You're looking at a situation where the 3 highest-paid players on the team are consuming so much of the salary pool that building genuine playoff depth becomes a strategic puzzle with very few solutions. The argument some analysts are making, that Indiana should try to bring Mitchell back on a one-year deal rather than a multi-year commitment, is not about disrespecting her value. It's about the calendar. Because 1 year from now, Clark becomes eligible for a maximum contract worth $1.3 million, and the year after that, the Supermax kicks in at $1.7 million. The question the Fever front office has to answer is deceptively simple on the surface and enormously complex underneath it. How do you pay everyone what they're worth when your salary cap, despite being the largest in league history, still isn't large enough to cover what your best players have actually earned? There is no elegant answer. There are only trade-offs. And the trade-offs the Fever make in the next 12 months will define whether Caitlin Clark's prime years in this league are spent competing for championships or watching a roster erode around her. The pressure on the Fever front office, on Amber Cox, on Kelly Krauskorp, on head coach Stephanie White is immense, and it's the kind of pressure that comes not from failure, but from success. The league's most compelling roster, playing in the market most energized by the WNBA's growth, now has to figure out how to keep it together under constraints that didn't exist a year ago. And then there's A'ja Wilson. Any honest conversation about the new CBA, about the Epic Clause, about the financial transformation of this league, that conversation is incomplete without talking about what Wilson is feeling right now. Because her story in all of this is genuinely complicated, and complicated stories deserve more than a hot take. Wilson has 3 MVP awards. She has an Olympic gold medal. She has a WNBA championship. She has built, over the course of her career, one of the most decorated resumes in this league's history. She's a legitimate all-time talent, the kind of player that franchise-building conversations used to revolve around.
And for years, she carried the flag for wage equality in this league, advocating publicly and vocally for the kind of pay structure that players deserved. She wanted this CBA, she fought for it, she worked for it. And now that it's here, the biggest news out of the entire agreement is that a player with 2 years of professional experience is about to become the highest paid player in the league's history.
That is not easy to process. It doesn't matter how professional you are, how many championships you've won, or how secure you are in your legacy. Watching someone else walk into the commercial opportunity that the system never gave you, after you spent years building the foundation that made that opportunity possible, is a specific kind of sting that doesn't go away with a press release about league progress. Wilson has been careful with her words in public, cryptic enough to communicate without making explicit statements, just enough edge in her interview responses to let anyone paying attention know exactly what was running underneath the surface. The posts that didn't need to name anyone because everyone already knew. The interview answers that were technically about the league, but clearly about something much more specific. When the Sportico year-end report on the highest-paid female athletes came out in 2025, Clark appeared at $16.1 million. Wilson wasn't even on the list, not because she isn't a great player, she is, but because her on-court excellence never translated into the kind of commercial machinery that Clark built almost immediately. Wilson never caused a Tuesday night regular season game to trend nationally. She never triggered a spike in opposing arenas' ticket sales just by appearing on the away schedule. She never helped push a midweek broadcast past 1 million viewers through sheer name recognition alone. Those aren't criticisms, they're just facts about 2 different types of impact in a sport that is now paying for one of them above almost everything else. Here's the thing that's genuinely hard to say, and genuinely necessary to say. The new CBA does not distribute money based on MVP trophies. It doesn't reward loyalty or longevity, or the years players spent fighting for a better league while getting paid next to nothing. It distributes money based on market impact. The epic clause exists because certain players change what the league is worth to sponsors, to broadcasters, to the casual fans who have never attended a women's basketball game but are suddenly watching one every week. Wilson built this league. Clark monetized it at a scale nobody had ever seen. And leagues that are growing as fast as the WNBA is right now prioritize that second thing in their pay structure, even when it creates the kind of uncomfortable inequity that Wilson's situation represents. That doesn't mean the frustration is invalid. Veterans who spent years underpaid while laying the foundation for this moment have every right to feel some kind of way about the distribution. The discomfort is real and it's legitimate. What it isn't is a reason to pretend that the epic clause is unfair in its design. It is responding to a specific, measurable, documented reality. That reality has a name on every spreadsheet in the league office, even if it doesn't appear in the official CBA language. Now let's talk about what the next 3 years actually look like, because the new deal isn't just about 2026, it's a roadmap. And the numbers on that roadmap tell a story that gets more interesting at every step. In 2026, Clark earns $530,000. That figure is real, it's signed, it's contractually binding, and it is still, by every honest assessment, the best bargain in professional team sports. The gap between what Clark generates for this league and what the league pays her on her WNBA contract is narrowing, but it has not closed. Not even close. The $530,000 is a step toward fairness, not an arrival at it. But it is the first step that has been taken on paper, which is more than the league was willing to do 12 months ago. In 2027, the picture changes significantly. Clark becomes eligible for a maximum contract worth $1.3 million. If the trajectory of the last 2 years continues, and there is very little evidence to suggest it won't, that extension will be signed with minimal drama and maximum fanfare.
The headlines will be historic, the number will feel enormous compared to where this league was, and it will still not fully capture what she's worth to every partner, every broadcaster, and every venue that sells out the moment her name appears on the calendar. In 2028, the Supermax kicks in at $1.7 million. That number will generate a new round of discussion from every corner of the league. Veterans who were underpaid for years will react. Columnists will write about the gap between the highest and lowest earners, and the league will simultaneously celebrate and quietly manage the PR of a pay structure that is still catching up to the reality it's acknowledging. Every time the number goes up, the conversation starts over. Every raise is both a victory and a reminder of how long it took to get there.
And through it all, the Indiana Fever will be navigating a salary structure that is generous by historical WNBA standards and ruthlessly constraining by the standards of building a championship roster. The cap squeeze will be real. The personnel decisions will be painful. Some players who deserve to stay will leave. Some depth that was taken for granted will disappear. This is the standard life cycle of a franchise built around a generational talent, and Indiana is about to experience every chapter of it in real time. What makes Clark's situation genuinely unprecedented in this league's history is not just the money, it's the fact that her presence forced the institution itself to confront what it had been doing wrong for years. The $78,000 salary didn't become a scandal because someone leaked a memo. It became a scandal because the numbers around it, the viewership data, the endorsement figures, the arena attendance reports, made it impossible to look away from. The league was caught paying its most valuable asset at a rate that couldn't be defended in any serious business conversation, and the only response was a 17-month negotiation that produced a document designed to make sure it never happened again. The Epic Clause is that document. The Caitlin Rule, whatever they decide to call it publicly or privately, is the league's written admission that it had no choice but to change. And the numbers, $78,000 to $530,000 to $1.3 million to $1.7 million, are the timeline of that change, laid out in the most honest language that institutions know how to speak, contract language. Here's where all of this lands. The WNBA's new collective bargaining agreement is a genuine achievement. The players who spent years fighting for better pay, better facilities, better working conditions, they moved the needle. The veterans who never got what they deserved, who played through the old structure and kept showing up anyway, they built the foundation that made this moment possible. That is real, and it should be acknowledged. And Caitlin Clark is the economic engine that made the owners finally open their wallets. That is also real. You can hold both of those things at the same time. You don't have to choose which one to credit and which one to minimize. The league's old guard built something worth fighting for. Clark arrived and made it impossible for the people writing the checks to look away. The new CBA is the result of both of those things being true simultaneously. What's no longer up for debate is the impact. Nobody in a serious conversation is still arguing about whether Clark matters to this league financially. The Epic Clause is a line item. A salary that goes from $78,000 to $530,000 is a line item. A league that increases its total salary cap by nearly 400% during the years that Clark plays in it is a line item. The argument ended when the lawyers started writing. Every time a WNBA owner who had been reluctant to move on salary conceded another point at the bargaining table, whether it was the cap number, the housing stipend, the revenue share conversation, the reason they moved was the same, and the reason had a name. The league that once paid its most transformative player the salary of an entry-level office worker is gone. What replaced it is a league that is officially, in writing, acknowledged what it has. A league that is still figuring out what that acknowledgement costs. A league where one roster in Indianapolis is about to feel the financial weight of getting everything right at exactly the same time. And a league where a player who has never appeared in a collective bargaining agreement by name has nonetheless reshaped every line of it. The stimulus package cleared, the checks are being written, and the game that comes next, The one about who stays, who leaves, who wins, and what this league becomes on the other side of this financial transformation. That game is just getting started. If you made it this far, drop a comment below. Do you think the Fever can keep this roster together, or is the cap squeeze going to break them apart before Clark ever gets a real shot at a championship? And subscribe if you haven't already. We're just getting started.